A black man in a gray sweater stood up in the back row of economy class, looked the airline vice president dead in the eyes, and said 6 words that made every first-class passenger stop breathing. "I own this plane, all of it." The cabin went so quiet you could hear someone's coffee cup trembling against the tray table. But here's the thing nobody saw coming: the jet sitting on that runway, shutting down an entire airport, wasn't an accident. It was a message, delivered by a man who had every reason to be angry and chose something far more devastating instead. Stay with me until the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel. Caleb Brooks had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because of nerves, not because of excitement. He had been awake because his 9-year-old daughter, Maya, had climbed into his bed at 3:47 a.m., wrapped her small arms around his waist, and pressed her forehead against his back the way she always did when something was bothering her. He had waited a long time before asking, "Baby, what's going on in that head of yours?" She didn't answer right away. Maya never answered right away. She had inherited that from him, the long silences before words, the way she turned things over in her mind before deciding they were worth saying out loud. Her mother used to say that the two of them communicated in a language made entirely of pauses. "Are you going to be safe on the airplane?" she finally asked. Caleb had turned over carefully, facing her in the dark. Her eyes were wide open, watching him with that particular kind of worry that children carry when they've already lost one parent, and the fear of losing another has moved into their chest like a permanent tenant. "I'm going to be completely safe," he said. "You promise?" "I promise, and you'll call me when you land, first thing." She stared at him for another long moment, clearly running some internal calculation. Then she nodded once, the way she did when a decision had been finalized, and closed her eyes. He hadn't slept again after that. He had lain there in the dark, listening to her breathe, thinking about his wife, thinking about New York, thinking about the meeting that was supposed to happen in 17 hours. His mind had run through everything the way it always did before a significant moment, cataloging risks, checking contingencies, running the numbers one more time. That was how Caleb had built his company. Not through recklessness, not through ego, through relentless, quiet preparation, through the discipline of a man who had decided, after the worst day of his life, that he would not leave anything to chance again. When the alarm went off at 5, he was already dressed. He had laid out his clothes the night before: the gray sweater, the dark jeans, the worn leather boots that had been resoled twice, but still had more life in them than he felt like admitting. He wasn't a man who cared about appearances in the way that most people in his world did. He had attended enough board meetings, enough charity galas, enough industry dinners to understand that the rooms full of the most powerful people were also often the rooms full of the most insecure people, men and women who had decided that the best way to announce their importance was to make everyone around them feel smaller. Caleb had made a different decision a long time ago. He made Maya's lunch before the sitter arrived, packed her backpack, left a note on the refrigerator with the sitter's number, his hotel number in New York, and a small drawing of a sun that he had sketched himself his way of telling her, without words, that the world would still be bright when he came back. Maya was still asleep when he kissed her forehead and walked out the door. He didn't look back, because if he looked back, he'd find a reason to stay. He had learned that about himself years ago. The drive to Hartsfield-Jackson was 45 minutes in light traffic. Caleb drove himself. He had a driver, his company offered it. His assistant had suggested it 100 times, but he preferred to drive. Driving alone in the early morning was one of the few places left where he could think without someone needing something from him. He parked in the long-term garage, pulled his single carry-on bag from the trunk, slung his old leather backpack over one shoulder, and walked toward the terminal. The airport was already alive at that hour in the particular way that major airports are always alive, that strange, pressurized energy of hundreds of people, all moving through the same space toward completely different destinations. Business travelers with rolling cases moving in tight, efficient strides. Families with strollers negotiating around each other. A group of college kids sprawled across a row of chairs, half asleep. Caleb moved through it easily. He had been in airports so many times in the past decade that he had developed a kind of internal navigation system. He knew instinctively which lines would move and which wouldn't, which security lanes would clear, which gate agents would be in a good mood, and which ones were already counting minutes until their shift ended. He cleared security without issue, found a coffee cart that was already open, and ordered a black coffee with the specific kind of brevity that comes from someone who has made the same order 1,000 times. He didn't check his phone. He didn't review his presentation. He found an empty seat near his gate, pulled the small folded drawing out of his shirt pocket, the one Maya had pressed into his hand as he'd left her room the night before, and looked at it. She had drawn the two of them standing in front of what appeared to be an airplane, though the airplane looked somewhat more like a flying bus. They were both smiling enormously. She had written at the bottom, in her careful, deliberate print, "Daddy comes home." Not a question, a statement, a command. He folded it carefully and put it back. The gate area for Flight 1147 to JFK was filling up the way first-class gate areas always did, slowly, with a particular kind of conscious performance. Men in tailored suits reading physical newspapers as a statement. Women in designer travel clothes, speaking in low, purposeful voices on calls that sounded important. A couple in matching luxury athleisure who seemed to have coordinated their outfits, their carry-ons, and their posture. Caleb sat among them in his gray sweater and said nothing. He was used to these rooms. He had attended enough early morning business flights to understand that the gate area for a first-class cabin was a performance space, a place where people who had decided that visibility was the same thing as importance put themselves on display. He didn't judge them for it. He understood it. He had simply never been able to make himself participate in it. His assistant, Dina, had booked the seat 3 weeks ago when the New York meeting had been confirmed. Seat 3A, window. He always took window seats because he liked looking out at the world from altitude. It had a way of returning perspective when everything on the ground was pressing in too close. When boarding began, he joined the first-class line without ceremony. He had his boarding pass on his phone, his ID in his front pocket. He moved forward when the line moved. He was aware, in the particular way that black men who have spent time in predominantly white professional spaces are always aware, that he didn't look like most of the people in the line around him. He was aware of the same way. He was aware of the temperature in a room or the sound quality of a speaker system, simply as information, as data, as a fact of the environment that he noted, without assigning it power over his behavior. He stepped up to the gate agent, held out his phone. The agent scanned it, nodded. He walked down the jet bridge. That was the last normal moment of the morning. He found seat 3A and settled in, backpack in the overhead, coffee wedged carefully in the seat pocket, Maya's drawing back in his shirt pocket, where it lived on travel days. He had pulled out his phone to text Dina a quick confirmation when the shadow fell across him. "Excuse me, sir." Caleb looked up. The flight attendant was a woman in her late 40s, sharp uniform, hair pulled back with the precision of someone who had been doing this job long enough that every element of their appearance was controlled. She had pleasant features arranged into a professionally pleasant expression, but her eyes, the thing he had learned to pay attention to when the rest of someone's face was performing, her eyes were doing something different. They were moving, from his face to his sweater, from his sweater to his backpack, which was a 12-year-old Patagonia bag that had been to 4 continents and looked exactly like that, from his backpack back to his face. "Sir, I believe there may have been an error with your seat assignment." Caleb didn't react. He had learned not to react in the first 3 seconds, because the first 3 seconds were when most people made their worst decisions. "Is that right?" he said. "First-class seating can sometimes get a little complicated at booking. Would you mind stepping out so we can take a look at this at the gate?" He reached into his pocket, the phone pocket, not the drawing pocket, and opened his boarding pass. He held it up so she could read it clearly. "Seat 3A. His name, his ticket class, all of it. That's my seat," he said. Not aggressively, not loudly, simply as information. She looked at the boarding pass, then back at him. Then she smiled the smile that wasn't a smile. "Of course, sir. I'm sure it is." But first class has specific. There are certain protocols about seating in the forward cabin, and sometimes economy passengers are accidentally assigned up here due to system errors. It happens more than you'd think. I'm not an economy passenger, Caleb said. Of course, of course. Let me just double-check with the senior crew member, just to make sure we get everything sorted properly. She moved away before he could respond. Caleb settled back in his seat. He looked out the window at the tarmac, where ground crew in orange vests were moving efficiently around the aircraft. He noted, as he always did, the particular smoothness of the operation, the fuel truck, the baggage handlers, the ground communication. He had spent a decade understanding how all of it worked. Every component, every system, he waited. The senior crew member was a man named, according to his name tag, Gerald. Gerald was tall, with the kind of practiced authority in his posture that comes from years of managing pressurized cabins and difficult passengers. He moved down the aisle with the confidence of a man who had diffused 100 situations and was prepared to diffuse one more. He stopped beside seat 3A, looked at Caleb, ran the same visual scan clothes, backpack, demeanor, and arrived at the same conclusion in approximately 4 seconds. Sir, Gerald began, with the particular tone of someone who has already decided how a conversation will end. I understand there's been some confusion about your seating. I want to assure you, we're going to take care of this. I don't have confusion about my seating, Caleb said. I have seat 3A. That's where I'm sitting. Sir, if you'll just bear with me. Have you scanned my boarding pass? Gerald paused. We can verify everything at the gate. You didn't scan it. She didn't scan it. Neither of you have verified anything in the system. You've looked at me and made a decision. The cabin was paying attention now. Not overtly, the other first-class passengers were maintaining the studied nonchalance of people who are listening with great intensity while appearing to look elsewhere, but the attention was there. Caleb could feel it, the way you feel a shift in atmospheric pressure. Gerald lowered his voice. Sir, I understand you're frustrated. I'm not frustrated, Caleb said, and this was true. He was something much colder than frustrated. I'm observing. There's a difference. We want to make sure all our passengers are comfortable. And sometimes. Who isn't comfortable right now? Caleb asked. He looked around the cabin slowly, deliberately. Is someone uncomfortable? Because the only person who seems to have a problem is you. A man in a window seat across the aisle very carefully repositioned his Financial Times. Gerald straightened. Something had shifted behind his eyes, a recalibration, a decision made. Sir, for the comfort of all passengers in the forward cabin, we'd like to offer you alternative seating in economy with a full first-class meal service. No, the word landed flat and final.
Sir, I want this interaction documented.
I want your name, her name. He nodded toward the flight attendant, who had come to stand behind Gerald at a supportive distance. The time, and the specific reason you are asking me to move. Gerald's professional composure developed a hairline fracture. That's really not. You said the word comfort twice, Caleb said. Whose comfort? Be specific. Nobody in the cabin was pretending to read anymore. Gerald recovered. Sir, I have a responsibility to manage this cabin efficiently. If you continue to make this difficult, I'll need to involve airport security. And there it was, the escalation, the threat. The final tool in the toolkit of a man who had decided, without evidence, without verification, without a single objective data point beyond his own assumptions, that the black man in the gray sweater did not belong in seat 3A. Caleb looked at Gerald for a long moment. He thought about what he could say. He thought about what his wife would have said. She would have been more eloquent, more devastating, more surgical than he had ever been. Elena had possessed the rare ability to make someone feel the full weight of their smallness without raising her voice above a conversational tone. She had been extraordinary in ways he was still discovering years after losing her. He thought about what Maya would think if she were watching. He thought about the meeting in New York. He thought about the 37 people at Brooks Aviation Group who had shown up this morning and would show up tomorrow and were building something that mattered. He made a decision. Fine, he said. He reached up and took his backpack from the overhead. He stood. At his full height 6'1", with the kind of quiet physical presence that tends to become visible only when someone finally stands up, He was taller than Gerald by 2 inches. "Fine," he said again. "But I'm going to need the documentation I requested. In writing. Before the doors close." Gerald nodded quickly, as if the speed of the agreement could erase what had just happened. "And I need you to understand something." Caleb's voice was still calm, still quiet, still the voice of a man who had decided long ago that anger was expensive and precision was free. "What just happened here has nothing to do with my boarding pass. And everybody in this cabin knows it." He didn't look around. He didn't gesture. He simply let the sentence settle into the air of the cabin like something that couldn't be taken back. Then picked up his carry-on and walked. He walked past business class. He walked through the main cabin, where the flight attendants watched him pass, with expressions that fell somewhere between discomfort and shame. He walked all the way to the back of the aircraft, to row 42, to the last middle seat in the last viable row, and he sat down between a college student with earbuds and an elderly woman with a crossword puzzle. He put his backpack under the seat in front of him. He took out his phone. He opened his email and composed a single message to Dina with the subject line, "Document everything. Full report. We'll talk when I land." Then he put the phone away. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out Maya's drawing. He looked at the flying bus, at the enormous smiles, at the words she had written at the bottom. In her careful, deliberate print, "Daddy comes home." He folded it along its original crease and held it in his hand. From the front of the plane, he could hear the muffled sounds of Gerald and the flight attendant moving through their procedures. He could hear the boarding door begin its pressurization sequence. He could feel the particular shift in cabin energy that happens when an aircraft is minutes from beginning to move. He closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about Gerald. He wasn't thinking about the first-class passengers who had watched it all happen and said nothing. He was thinking about something his wife had told him once during the early years when his company was struggling and the weight of it was pressing down on both of them in ways they didn't always have words for. They had been sitting at the kitchen table late at night, the kind of late that bleeds into early, and he had said something like, "What's the point of all of it if people are still going to look at me like that?" And Elena had been quiet for a long time, in the way she always was before she said something worth saying. Then she had looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said, "Your character is proven when you have the power to embarrass someone, and you choose not to. That's the only power that matters. Everything else is just noise." He had thought about that conversation 1,000 times in the years since she died. He thought about it now, sitting in the last row of economy class, holding his daughter's drawing, while the aircraft he partly owned began to prepare for pushback. And then something happened. The engines, which had begun their initial sequence, went quiet. The aircraft stopped moving. The intercom clicked on, and the captain's voice filled the cabin with a carefully neutral tone that professional aviators use specifically to prevent panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be experiencing a brief delay here on the taxiway. We've been asked to hold position temporarily. We appreciate your patience, and we'll have more information shortly." From his window seat, the elderly woman with the crossword had graciously offered to switch when she noticed him craning. Caleb could see the taxiway. He could see the runway beyond it. And on that runway, sitting with the particular stillness of something that was precisely where it intended to be, was a private aircraft. White fuselage, clean lines, a registration number that he knew as well as his own address. Caleb looked at it for a long moment. Then, for the first time all morning, he smiled. Not a large smile, not a triumphant one. The quiet smile of a man who has prepared for a great many things in his life, and whose preparations have a way of speaking for themselves. In the row behind him, someone said, "What's going on? Why is there a plane just sitting on the runway?" Someone else said, "That's weird. That's really weird. They can't just do that." From somewhere closer to the front of the economy cabin, a flight attendant's voice, strained with a professionalism that was clearly being maintained through significant effort. "Nats, ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed of a brief ground hold. Our crew is in communication with the tower. We expect this to be resolved very shortly." It would not be resolved very shortly. Caleb already knew that. The aircraft on the runway bore the tail number he had personally selected 9 years ago, when Brooks Aviation Group had taken delivery of its first owned aircraft. He had let Maya help choose it. She had been 3 months old, obviously, but he had held her up to the window of the hangar and told her it was her decision. And then he had chosen the number himself while she gurgled at the ceiling. N8816. M for Maya. M for the mother she would grow up without. He looked at it, sitting there on the runway, immovable, calm, and absolutely purposeful. And he thought, sometimes a message needs to be sent in a language that everyone can understand. The intercom clicked again. The captain's voice returned, and this time beneath the practiced neutrality. If you were listening closely, if you had spent years learning to hear the thing behind the thing, there was something different in it. Something that sounded like a man who has just looked at a passenger manifest and seen a name that has changed his understanding of the last 45 minutes entirely. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been notified that the ground hold is going to require us to return briefly to the gate for an operational matter. We sincerely apologize for this inconvenience and will be back underway as soon as possible. The aircraft began its slow turn back toward the terminal. In row 42, between the college student who had fallen back asleep and the elderly woman who had returned to her crossword, Caleb Brooks put Maya's drawing carefully back into his shirt pocket, right against his chest, and watched out the window as the private jet on the runway held its position quiet, still, and completely unmovable against the early morning light. He thought about Gerald. He thought about flight attendant with the moving eyes. He thought about every passenger in that first-class cabin who had watched it happen and decided collectively that it was not their problem. He wasn't angry at any of them. He was something more complicated than angry. He was a man who had spent 36 years learning that the world had a particular set of assumptions about what he was and what he deserved, and that the most powerful thing he could do more powerful than any lawsuit, any press release, any public confrontation was to simply be exactly who he was, in full, without apology, and let the world adjust its understanding. The aircraft docked at the gate with a soft mechanical thud. Outside, Caleb could see a cluster of airport personnel gathering near the jet bridge. Men in suits, men with radios. A woman who had the specific posture of someone who has been awakened by a very bad phone call and has been moving at full speed ever since. He recognized her. Sandra Wise, Vice President of Ground Operations for Continental Sky Airlines. He had been in 3 meetings with her. She was very good at her job. She was also, at this particular moment, moving toward the jet bridge with the expression of a woman's up who has just realized that the worst assumption she could have made about the last hour is the correct one. Caleb sat quietly. He was in no hurry. He had all the time in the world. The gate had come to him. He thought of Maya, of the way she had pressed her forehead against his back at 3:47 in the morning, and asked him, with the directness of a child who has already learned that love and loss live in the same house, whether he was going to be safe. He was going to be safe. He was going to be better than safe. He was going to land in New York, take his meeting, build his company another level higher, and come home to that drawing, and the girl who drew it, and he was going to sit with her at the kitchen table and tell her. Because he believed in telling her the truth, even the complicated truth that today someone had decided to judge him by his clothes and his skin and the age of his backpack, and that it had not gone the way they expected. And Maya, who at 9 years old already had her mother's eyes and her father's silences, would look at him and say something that would rearrange a piece of his heart. He didn't know what it would be yet. He was looking forward to finding out. The door of the aircraft opened. The sound of the jet bridge, the particular acoustics of that pressurized tunnel between an aircraft and the world came flooding in. And then Sandra Weiss stepped through the door, and she looked immediately, instinctively, toward the front of the plane, toward first class, toward where she expected a man of Caleb Brooks' status to be sitting. It took her a moment that Caleb would think about later, in a quiet way, not with satisfaction, but with something more useful than satisfaction, to turn her gaze all the way to the back of the aircraft, to row 42, to the man in the gray sweater sitting in the last row of economy class, holding his daughter's drawing against his chest, watching her with calm, patient, completely unimpressed eyes. Her face did something complicated. Caleb stood up. He slung his backpack over his shoulder. He walked up the aisle, The same aisle he had walked down 30 minutes ago, past the same passengers who had watched everything happen and said nothing, and he walked with the unhurried, deliberate stride of a man who has spent his entire adult life proving that where you sit on an airplane has nothing to do with who you are when you stand up. He reached Sandra Weiss. She opened her mouth. He held up one hand gently, not dismissively, and said, "Let me ask you one question first." She closed her mouth. "Did anyone at this airline verify my boarding pass before asking me to move?" The silence that followed, the kind of silence that answers the question better than any words could. Caleb nodded slowly. "Once." "Okay," he said. "Then I think we have a few things to talk about." He stepped through the door and into the jet bridge, and the morning which had begun with his daughter's arms around his waist in the dark and was now moving towards something that neither Gerald nor the flight attendant nor any of the silent passengers in the first class cabin had seen, coming stretched out ahead of him. Long, complicated, and entirely his. Sandra Weiss had been in aviation operations for 22 years. She had managed hurricane diversions. She had handled a bomb threat on a Tuesday afternoon in Phoenix that turned out to be a forgotten gym bag belonging to a terrified orthodontist. She had personally overseen the evacuation of a 737 at Dallas-Fort Worth when a hydraulic line failed on pushback. And she had done all of it with the kind of controlled, methodical calm that comes from a woman who has spent 2 decades treating every crisis as fundamentally a logistics problem, waiting for the right solution. She was not calm right now. She was doing an exceptional performance of calm, which is a completely different thing, and Caleb Brooks, who had spent the last decade in rooms full of people performing emotions they didn't feel, could see the difference immediately. He let her walk beside him through the jet bridge without speaking. He had learned that silence, deployed correctly, was more effective than any opening statement he could make. People who were performing calm needed time to find the seams in their performance, and those seams were where the truth lived. Sandra Weiss found her seam about halfway down the jet bridge. "Mr. Brooks." Her voice was level, professional, and carrying about 40% more weight than the words themselves. "I want to begin by saying that what happened this morning it represents a serious departure from our service standards, and I want to assure you personally, Sandra." He said her name the way he said most things quietly, without edges. "I know you. You're good at your job. So let's skip the part where you read from the script and go straight to the part where we talk like adults." She stopped walking. He stopped with her. They were alone in the jet bridge now, the aircraft behind them, the terminal ahead, the particular fluorescent limbo of the connecting tunnel, holding them both in a kind of a suspended moment. "Okay," she said, and something in her posture shifted, not a collapse, but a release of the performance. The real Sandra Weiss, the 22-year veteran, who had handled a bomb threat on a Tuesday in Phoenix, stepped slightly forward. "Okay, here's where we are. A senior crew member and a flight attendant asked you to vacate a seat you had legally purchased without verifying your boarding pass, without checking the system, and from what I've been told in the last 10 minutes, without any basis other than a visual assessment of your..." She stopped. "Of how I look," Caleb said. "Yes, the word cost her something. Of how you look. And then when you moved to economy, which you absolutely should not have done, and I want that on record, someone made a call from this aircraft to a number that triggered a ground instruction to N8816M. Nobody made a call," Caleb said. She looked at him. "I'm sorry? Nobody on this aircraft made any call. The ground instruction was on a pre-authorized protocol. My operations team runs a standard location-based check whenever I board a commercial flight. If I'm not in my assigned seat at pushback, there's a procedure." Sandra Weiss stared at him for a long moment. "Your operations team," she repeated slowly. "I have 37 employees, Sandra. A lot of them care very much about what happens to me on an airplane. Given what my company does, I think that's reasonable." "Your company," she said, and he could see the specific moment, the precise neural second, when she was connecting the dots she should have connected before any of this started. "Brooks Aviation Group, yes, which holds a partial infrastructure contract with your airline's ground operations division at 6 major hubs, including this one. Yes, he let that settle, not cruelly, simply as fact. I mentioned that not as a threat, Sandra. I want to be very clear about that. I mention it because I want you to understand the full scope of what happened this morning. And I don't want there to be any confusion later about whether I was just some random passenger who got bumped. She took a breath. It was a long breath, the kind that people take when they are recalibrating a situation from the ground up. How long has that contract been in place? The initial agreement was 4 years ago. We renegotiated last spring, and she stopped herself. No one thought to flag it? No one thought to check whether a passenger named Caleb Brooks on a first-class manifest might be someone worth treating with basic professional courtesy. He shook his head slowly. That's actually not the part that bothers me most, Sandra. What part bothers you most? He looked at her steadily. The part where nobody in that cabin said anything. 12 people sat there and watched it happen and decided it wasn't their problem. That bothers me more than Gerald. That bothers me more than the flight attendant. Because Gerald and the flight attendant are a training problem. The 12 people who stayed quiet, that's a culture problem. And culture problems are a lot harder to fix. Sandra Weiss was quiet for a moment. Then quietly, you're right, I know. They stood there in the jet bridge, and around them the airport was moving ground crews, baggage carts, the distant sound of another aircraft's engines cycling up. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because some things need a moment of silence before the next part can begin. Then Caleb said, I want to meet with the crew, Gerald and the flight attendant, before anyone else talks to them, before legal gets involved, before HR constructs a narrative. I want to sit with them for 15 minutes, just us. Sandra blinked. That's Mr. Brooks. I have to be honest with you. That's not the typical protocol in a situation like. I know it's not typical. I'm asking anyway. She studied him. He could see her trying to categorize this request, trying to find the file in her 22 years of experience where something like this lived, and coming up empty. Why? She asked finally. Because I remember being wrong about something once, Caleb said. And the person who changed my understanding didn't sue me, didn't embarrass me, sat down across from me and talked to me like I was capable of learning. I'm still grateful for that. I want to give these people the same thing. Sandra looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, in a voice that had lost all of its performance, and was simply, plainly human, you're a harder man to be angry at than you should be. My wife used to say something similar. He started walking again. She walked with him. The terminal opened up ahead of them, bright and loud and alive, and Sandra Weiss reached for her radio and began making calls, and Caleb kept his hand in his shirt pocket, where Maya's drawing lived. And the morning moved forward. They put him in a small conference room near the operations center, the kind of room that exists in every major airport as a kind of bureaucratic pressure valve neutral walls, a table that belonged to no era in particular, chairs that had been sat in by angry passengers and apologetic airline representatives for decades. There was a coffee maker on a side table that looked like it had been purchased in 2003 and had not been asked to do anything different since. Caleb made himself a cup of coffee. He was on his second sip when the door opened. The flight attendant came in first. Her name was Patricia Holloway, 47 years old, 17 years with the airline, and she walked into that room the way people walk into rooms, where they expect to be told something terrible about themselves. She held her posture carefully. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her face had the particular expression of someone who has been running a loop in their head for the last 40 minutes and hasn't been able to stop it. Gerald Marsh came in behind her. He was trying, Caleb could see, to maintain the operational authority that had served him well in the cabin. But something about the conference room, or perhaps something about the last 40 minutes, had altered it. He looked like a man wearing a suit that had once fit perfectly and had since changed in some way that couldn't quite be identified. They both sat. Neither of them looked directly at Caleb. There was a third chair between them, and they turned between them, in the way that people leave space, tight bunch, when they're not sure where the threat is coming from. Sandra Weiss stood by the door. I'll give you 15 minutes, she said to Caleb. He nodded. She left. The three of them sat in the small room. The coffee maker, on the side table, made a sound like it was considering doing something, and then decided against it. "I'm not here to fire you," Caleb said. Patricia Holloway's hands unknotted slightly. Gerald Marsh's posture shifted, but his expression stayed careful. "I want to be clear about that, because I think you've both been sitting in here, or wherever they've had you waiting, imagining that's what this is. And I want to take that off the table first, because I can't have a real conversation with two people who think they're about to lose their jobs." Neither of them spoke, but they were listening in a way that Caleb recognized.
The kind of minutes
That happens when someone's defenses have taken a hit and there's suddenly room inside the silence for something honest. "My name is Caleb Brooks," he continued. "I'm the founder and CEO of Brooks Aviation Group. We hold ground operations contracts at 6 major hubs, including this one, and we're a partial stakeholder in the technology infrastructure that runs this airline's boarding systems." He paused. "I'm telling you this not to establish authority, but because you deserve to understand the full picture of what happened this morning. You made assumptions about me based on how I looked. Those assumptions were wrong. But here's the thing I want you to think about." He leaned forward. "If I wasn't who I am, if I was just a man who'd saved up for a first-class ticket, a man who'd worked overtime for 3 months to afford it, a man who'd told his kids, his daughter, that he was flying first class on this trip because he'd earned it and he wanted to do something that felt like he'd made it, even if just for 4 hours, would what happened to him be okay?" Silence. The coffee maker reconsidered whatever it had been considering. Gerald Marsh opened his mouth and closed it again. There was something happening behind his eyes, a kind of internal reckoning that was louder than anything he could have said out loud. Patricia Holloway looked at the table. Then she looked up at Caleb. "No," she said. Her voice was smaller than her cabin voice. "No, it wouldn't be okay. Why did you approach me in the first place?" Caleb asked her directly. Not the official answer, the real one. "What went through your mind when you saw me in seat 3A? She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Gerald started to say something, and Caleb held up one hand gently, without force, and Gerald stopped. Patricia Holloway looked at the table again. Then at Caleb. Then she said the thing that cost her the most. "You didn't look like you belonged there. What does belonging look like?" She couldn't answer that. He hadn't expected her to. The question wasn't rhetorical, it was real, and it was hard, and he wanted it to live with her, because the living with it was where the change happened. "I have a daughter," Caleb said. "She's 9, her name is Maya. And before I left this morning, she asked me if I was going to be safe on the airplane." He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the drawing. He set it flat on the table between them. "She drew this for me." Patricia Holloway looked at it. The flying bus, the enormous smiles. "Daddy comes home." Something crossed her face that she didn't try to hide, and Caleb was glad she didn't, because hiding it would have meant she hadn't understood. "I raise her alone," he said. "Her mother died when Maya was 18 months old. Car accident. Winter road. Other driver ran a light." He picked up the drawing and folded it back along its crease. "I built my company after that. Working nights, working weekends, working hours that my wife would have told me were too many. I built it because I wanted to give Maya something. Not just money, not just security. Something she could look at and say my father built that. My father decided that what happened to us wasn't the end of the story." Gerald Marsh looked like he was having a very difficult conversation with himself in real time. "I don't tell you this to make you feel worse," Caleb continued. "I tell you because I want you to understand that the man in seat 3A has a story. He always has a story. And the story is almost always more than what you can see from the door of a first-class cabin." The room was very quiet, then Gerald said, and when he said it, his operational authority was entirely gone, and what was left was just a man in a room trying to say a true thing. "I owe you an apology. A real one, not a procedural one, I know you do." Gerald stopped, started again. "What we did this morning was wrong. Not just professionally, personally. And I've been in this job long enough to know better." He paused. "I did know better. I made a choice, and I made it fast, and I made it based on something I'm not proud of." Caleb nodded. "The speed is the thing, isn't it? The speed of the decision. That's what tells you where the assumption actually lives." Gerald looked at his hands. "Yes, nobody makes a slow assumption. Slow thinking is deliberate. Assumptions happen in the gap before deliberate thinking kicks in. That's why they're dangerous. Because they feel like instinct when they're actually just habit. Learned habit. He looked at both of them. I'm not asking you to feel terrible about yourselves for the rest of your careers. I'm asking you to slow down, that's it. 2 extra seconds every time. 2 seconds between seeing someone and deciding you know their story. That's the whole ask. Patricia Holloway's eyes were wet. She was not crying. She was holding it with the practiced control of a woman in a professional setting who had decided she would not cry in this meeting. But her eyes were wet, and she didn't look away from Caleb when she said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, and I don't expect that to fix anything. It doesn't fix anything, Caleb agreed. But it's not nothing either. There's a difference between an apology that's given to protect the person apologizing and one that's given for the person receiving it. That one felt like the second kind. He paused. Thank you for it. She nodded, pressed her lips together. Caleb stood. Gerald and Patricia both moved to stand. He waved them back down. Stay. Take a minute. You don't need to walk out of here looking composed for my benefit. He picked up his backpack. I told Sandra Ways, I'm not recommending termination for either of you. I want that to be your decision to communicate, not mine. It means more coming from you. And I want it communicated before legal gets in there and turns it into a policy document. He looked at Gerald. If I were in your position, I would use this. Use it. Don't file it away. He went to the door. Then he turned back, because there was one more thing and he had decided to say it, even though it wasn't necessary. Even though the meeting was technically over, because Elena would have said it, and he was trying, in the ways that mattered, to keep saying the things she would have said. My wife used to tell me that character is proven when you have the power to embarrass someone, and you choose not to. I believed her then, and I believe her more now. This morning, you had the power, and you used it. I had the power, and I chose not to. I want you to sit with that difference. Not because I want you to feel ashamed. Because I want you to understand what it looks like when someone uses power the right way. So that next time when you have it, he paused. You recognize what you're holding. He opened the door. He walked out. Sandra Wise was in the corridor, leaning against the opposite wall with the patient posture of someone who has managed a great many crises and has learned that some things can only be waded through. She straightened when Caleb came out. How'd it go? Well, he adjusted his backpack. No terminations. She exhaled. Mr. Brooks, Caleb. She seemed to take a moment with that. The ground situation, N8000. 816M has cleared the runway. Your operations director communicated that about 4 minutes ago. Good. He checked the time. He was going to miss his original flight. He had already known he would miss it. He had made peace with it, somewhere around row 42. I need to get to New York. What's the next available? Sandra Weiss pulled out her phone with the efficiency of a woman who had already looked this up before he'd walked out of the conference room. There's a 10:15 with seats available in first class. Seats 2A and 2B if you want to spread out. Full flat bed. Or, she hesitated, and something slightly uncomfortable moved across her professional composure. Your ground operations manager mentioned that N8000 816M has a New York clearance on file. If you'd prefer, book me on the 10:15, Caleb said. Coach. She looked up from her phone. I'm sorry, Coach. Whatever's open. Doesn't matter where. She stared at him. Caleb, we'd like to given what happened. We very much want to. Sandra. He said her name with the same quiet weight he'd been using all morning. I didn't move to row 42 because I was forced to. I moved because I wanted to document, clearly and without any ambiguity, what they were doing. I sat in economy because it was the right tactical choice at the right moment. And I'm flying coach on the 10:15 because I want to. He looked at her steadily. Because I want someone to look at me in that seat and decide I don't belong there. And I want to sit there completely at peace. Because that's the whole point. She stared at him for another moment. Then she shook her head once, not in disagreement, but in the way people shake their heads when they have encountered something they weren't prepared to encounter. Window or aisle, she asked. Done. She typed. There's also the matter of a formal statement. Our communications team is going to want to, might man. Tell your communications team to call Dina. She handles my media. They'll get a statement when it's ready and not before." Sandra nodded, making notes. "And I want two things from you personally, Sandra. Not from the airline, from you." She looked up. "I want a commitment that this incident goes into a company-wide review. Not a one-location training session, not a memo. A full structural review of crew protocols around passenger verification and bias in service delivery. I want it tracked. I want outcomes measured. You'll have it," she said. There was no hesitation. "And the second thing," he paused, "the 12 passengers who sat in that first-class cabin and watched what happened and said nothing. I want you to think about that. Because I don't want anything from them. I don't want their names. I don't want them notified or reprimanded or contacted. But I want you, personally, to think about what it means that 12 people watched a man get treated that way and decided it wasn't their problem. Because the crew members in that room just told me they were sorry and I believed them. But the 12 people in those seats," he shook his head, "they're going to get on another flight and sit in another first-class cabin and watch it happen again and again, and they're going to keep deciding it's not their problem. And that's the part of this that keeps me up at night." Sandra Weiss held his gaze for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. "That's all I'm asking." He shifted his backpack to his other shoulder. "Now I need to call my daughter before she gets on the school bus." He found a quiet corner near gate C-22 and called Maya's cell phone, the limited-use phone he'd given her 6 months ago after considerable deliberation, programmed with 4 numbers, 2 of which were his. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. "Daddy? Hey, baby, you said you'd call when you landed. I haven't landed yet. There was a change in the schedule. I'm still at the airport." A pause. The particular pause of a 9-year-old running a rapid threat assessment. Did something bad happen? He thought about how to answer that. He always thought carefully about how to answer Maya's direct questions. Because she deserved careful answers, and because she was far more perceptive than the adults in her life sometimes remembered. "Something happened," he said, "but I handled it, and I'm fine. And I'm going to get on another plane in about an hour and get to New York and have my meeting and call you tonight." What kind of something? The kind where some people made wrong assumptions and then had to figure out what to do with them. Another pause. Were they mean to you? The question landed on him in the simple, devastating way that children's direct questions always landed, with no protective framing, no diplomatic softening, just the pure unmediated reality of it. "Some of them were," he said. "Yeah, why? Because they saw me and decided they knew my story before they asked me what it was." Maya was quiet for a moment. He could hear the house behind her, the sitter moving in the kitchen, the sound of the morning news on low. "That's not fair," she said. "No, it's not. Did you tell them?" "I told them some things. I'm still deciding about others." "Daddy?" "Yeah. You know how you always tell me that how people treat you says more about them than it does about you." He closed his eyes for a second. "Yeah, I think you should remember that today." He stood there in gate C-22 with his old backpack and his gray sweater and the drawing in his shirt pocket, and his 9-year-old daughter delivered his own wisdom back to him with the devastating precision that only children can manage clean. Unironic, completely sincere. And he felt something unlock in his chest that he hadn't realized was locked. "You're right," he said. "I know." And then, after a beat, with a timing that was entirely her mother's, "Can I have a croissant from New York?" He laughed. It was a real laugh, not a performance. The kind that comes up from somewhere genuine and arrives without warning. And a man walking past him with a rolling suitcase glanced over and smiled reflexively. The way people always smile at the sound of an unexpected real laugh in an airport. "I'll bring you 2, Caleb said. 3, 2.5. Deal. Call me when you land for real. First thing," he said. "I love you, Maya. Love you, Daddy. Don't let anybody be mean to you anymore." "I'll do my best." She hung up. He stood there for a moment holding the phone in one hand, and the feeling in his chest that unlocked, particular feeling, the one that only Maya could produce. That combination of grief and gratitude and love so layered, it didn't have a single name. And he let himself feel it, without pushing it anywhere. Then he put the phone away. Then he went to find his gate. The 1015 to JFK was a different aircraft, a different gate, and a different crew, and Caleb moved through the boarding process with the unhurried efficiency he'd brought to airports for a decade. He found his seat 24F, window settled in, arranged his backpack, and noticed with a quiet internal note that the seat was slightly narrower than the one he'd been sitting in on the 8-0, and that the man seated in 24E was a large man with broad shoulders who had already claimed the shared armrest with the unthinking confidence of someone who had never had to think about these things. Caleb didn't say anything about the armrest. He looked out the window at the tarmac, where the morning was now fully arrived. The early light burned off and replaced with the flat white brightness of a clear Georgia day. He thought about what came next. Not the meeting in New York, though the meeting was real, and mattered, and had things at stake that he'd need to be sharp for. Not the statement that Dina would eventually release, or the structural review he'd extracted from Sandra Wise, or the various ways that the morning's events would ripple outward in directions he couldn't fully predict. He thought about the training program. He had been thinking about it since somewhere around row 42, forming it in the back of his mind while the cabin held its collective breath around him. It had taken shape in the jet bridge with Sandra Weiss. It had solidified in the conference room with Gerald and Patricia Holloway. It wasn't enough to have a policy. Policies were pieces of paper. Policies were memos that people read once and filed away. The thing that had happened this morning wasn't a policy failure. It was a human failure, the kind that lived in the half-second between perceiving and deciding, in the assumption that moved faster than thinking, in the 12 people who had decided that watching was the same as not participating. He needed something that changed the half-second. He opened his laptop. He started typing. Not a formal document yet, those would come later, with Dina's help and the company's legal team, and probably some very boring conference calls about implementation timelines. Right now it was just notes, thoughts in raw form, the way his best thinking always started ungainly, scattered, too large for whatever container he tried to put it in. The assumption is the problem, not the result of the assumption. The crew members could be trained out of the behavior. The 12 passengers are harder. The 12 passengers represent the ambient permission that makes the behavior possible. Without the silence, the behavior can't sustain itself. 2-second rule. Between perception and decision, create a mandatory pause. Build the pause into the process. Make the pause structural, not voluntary. Story. Every passenger has a story. The story is always larger than what you can see. Train around the story, not around the passenger. He typed for 40 minutes without looking up. The man in 24E fell asleep almost immediately, and his elbow slid off the armrest entirely. Caleb noticed this and said nothing, and kept typing. They were somewhere over North Carolina when the flight attendant came down the aisle with the drink cart and stopped beside him and said, "Can I get you anything, sir?" He looked up from his laptop. She was young, early 20s, new uniform still, with its original crispness. Her expression was attentive and open, and contained no subtext at all. Just the straightforward, professional question of a person doing her job. "Black coffee if you have it," he said. "Of course." 1 second. She reached for the carafe and poured with the efficient care of someone learning to do something well. "Here you go. Anything else?" "That's everything. Thank you." She smiled, a real one, not performed. The kind that young people have before the job teaches them to manage their expressions, and move the cart forward. Caleb held the coffee with both hands and looked out the window at the country unrolling below him, the neat parcels of farmland giving way to the Piedmont's spreading carpet of green. And he thought about Gerald Marsh sitting in that conference room, and about Patricia Holloway's wet eyes, and about the 12 people who had looked at their phones while a man was walked from his seat. He thought about Maya's arms around his waist in the dark at 3:47 in the morning. He thought about Elena, who had been gone for 7 years now and was present in every room he walked into, and every decision he made, and the face of his daughter, and the reason he kept doing the work when the work was difficult, which was most of the time. He thought about the drawing in his pocket. Daddy comes home. He drank his coffee. He went back to his notes. He had a lot of work to do. The plane moved northeast through clear air, and below them, America spread out in all its complicated, contradictory, occasionally infuriating, persistently extraordinary vastness. And Caleb Brooks sat in seat 24F in the coach cabin of a 10:15 flight to New York and built something that mattered. And outside the window the light was very bright, and the country was very large, and the morning was still, against all odds and reasonable expectations, far from over. When the aircraft touched down at JFK, Caleb was the 14th person off the plane, because he let the man in 24E go first. The man woke up at landing with the startled energy of someone who hadn't meant to fall that deeply asleep, and was gathering himself with the flustered haste of someone running late, and he let the family in the row ahead of him go, and the college student, and a woman with a complicated bag situation. And then he walked up the aisle with his backpack over one shoulder and his laptop under his arm, and Maya's drawing in his shirt pocket. He walked through the jet bridge. He walked into the terminal. He found a spot near the windows, took out his phone, and called his daughter. She answered on the first ring. "You landed." "I landed," he confirmed. "Good." He could hear her school bag zipping up in the background. The sounds of the sitter's voice saying something about the bus. "Daddy? Yeah, I'm proud of you." He stood at the windows of JFK with the runways spreading out ahead of him and the skyline of the city visible beyond, and his daughter's voice in his ear, and he felt something very large and very quiet move through him. "What for, baby?" "For not letting them make you small." He stood there. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother would have said the same thing." "I know," Maya said simply. "I've been practicing." He smiled. He stood at the window and he smiled, and the city was loud and bright and full, and the day was still unfolding, and there was a meeting to get to and a training program to build and a daughter to bring croissants to. And he was not small, and he had never been small, and nobody in the world had the authority to make him small. And he held on to that truth the way he held on to the drawing, not because he needed it to be true, but because it was true, and because some truths require the deliberate act of holding. "Go catch your bus," he said. "Already running. Love you." "Love you, Maya." She was gone. He put the phone away. He picked up his carry-on. He went to find a cab. The cab driver's name was Maurice, and he had been driving in New York for 19 years. And within 4 minutes of leaving JFK, he had formed a complete and confident opinion about the traffic on the Van Wyck, the current state of American politics, and the specific moral failings of the driver of a white panel van that had just cut him off near the interchange. Caleb sat in the back and let Maurice talk. He had learned, over years of cab rides and Uber trips and car services in a dozen cities, that sometimes the best thing you could do in the back of a moving vehicle was give the driver the gift of a genuine audience. Maurice was the kind of man who had spent 19 years observing the city from the front seat of a cab, watching it, the way only people who are paid to move through it without belonging to any one piece of it can watch it. And his opinions were specific and vivid and occasionally brilliant, the way opinions formed from real long observation tend to be. "You in town for business?" Maurice asked, catching his eye in the rear view. "Meeting Midtown. What kind of business?" "Aviation." Maurice processed this. "Like planes?" "Like planes." "Huh." A pause for a lane change executed with the fluid aggression of long experience. "You a pilot?" "No. I build systems that make the infrastructure work. Ground operations, boarding technology, maintenance tracking. So you're the guy I should be mad at when my flight gets canceled." "Statistically, probably not, but I understand the impulse." Maurice laughed. It was a large laugh for a small car. "You fly a lot, more than I'd like. Any good ones? Good stories?" Caleb looked out at the expressway, at the city, assembling itself in the distance, the way New York assembles itself when you approach from the south, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece slightly too large to absorb individually. The whole thing arriving before you've finished processing any of it. "Had an interesting one this morning," he said. "Yeah? What happened?" He thought about how much to say. He thought about Maurice. 19 years in the front seat, watching the city, watching people, forming his vivid, specific opinions. He thought about the fact that Maurice had asked him what he did, and listened to the answer, and asked a follow-up question, and none of those things had contained a single assumption of what someone who looked like Caleb could or couldn't be. I bought a first-class ticket, Caleb said. Airline moved me to economy because they didn't think I belonged up front. The cab went quiet for a second. Not the way rooms went quiet, more like the specific quality of silence that happens in a small enclosed space when something true has been said without warning. Maurice looked at him in the rear view, long enough that Caleb instinctively checked the road ahead. They actually do that, Maurice said. They did it this morning. Man. Maurice shook his head. Then, with the directness of someone who had 19 years of material to draw from, I had a guy in this cab last year. Surgeon, cardiothoracic, going to NYU Langone. Nicely dressed, the whole thing. And I started to drive past him. You know how it is. You're moving. You see someone at the curb, you make a call in half a second. He paused. I stopped myself. I thought, Maurice, don't be the thing you hate. So I stopped. Guy gets in. Best conversation I had all month. Tipped me 40%. What stopped you? Caleb asked. That half second. What made you pause? Maurice was quiet for a moment. Genuinely quiet, thinking about it, rather than performing the thinking. My son, he said finally. My son is 23. He's at Columbia studying. I don't even fully understand what he's studying. Something with data and systems. And I think about him walking around this city, and people making calls in half a second about who he is. He shook his head. I made a rule for myself, no half-second calls. If I catch myself doing it, I stop. Doesn't matter what I see, I stop. Caleb looked at him in the rear view. You should go into training, he said. Maurice laughed again. What, like corporate? I'm serious. What you just described, that's the whole thing. That's the entire lesson. No half-second calls. I've been working on a training framework for the last 2 hours, and you just said it better than I did in 40 minutes of notes. Maurice looked pleased in the way that people look pleased when their private wisdom is unexpectedly validated by a stranger. What kind of training framework? For airline crews. What happened to me this morning? I'm turning it into something. A program. Bias in service delivery. Passenger verification protocols. The whole structure. And you got the authority to do that? The airline's going to listen to you? Caleb smiled. The airline has a contract with my company. Maurice processed this in the rearview mirror. Then a slow, broad smile spread across his face. So they moved the man who owns the system to the back of the plane. Partial stakeholder, but essentially, yes. Man, Maurice said. And this time it was a word of pure appreciation, the kind you use when the universe has delivered a story that is too well constructed to be anything but true. Man, oh man, what happened to the runway thing? I heard something on the radio. You heard about the runway? Airport delays out of Atlanta. Something about a private aircraft holding position on an active runway. That was you? That was my operations team running a protocol. A protocol. Maurice repeated the word with a specific richness, turning it over like a coin to look at both sides. They call it a protocol and it shuts down an airport for about 40 minutes. That is the best thing I've heard all year. Maurice took an exit with authority. You know what that is? That's chess. That's playing chess when everybody else is playing checkers. You don't yell, you don't curse, you just move a piece, and the whole board changes. Caleb thought about that for a moment. He thought out Elena again, Elena who had loved chess, who had tried to teach him the game, and eventually concluded, not unkindly, that he understood the strategy, but lacked the patience for the sitting still. She had said it was his one genuine weakness. She had been right, as she almost always was. My wife used to play chess, he said. She good? She was very good. Where is she now? She passed. 7 years ago. The cab was quiet again. The specific quality of quiet that follows an unexpected death mentioned simply without apology. I'm sorry, Maurice said. And it sounded like he meant it. Thank you, kids. One daughter, 9 years old. She's the reason for everything at this point. They usually are, Maurice said, with the authority of a man who has a son at Columbia. Then, after a moment, you going to be okay? With the meeting and everything after the morning you had? Caleb found the question unexpectedly moving. Not because it was complicated. Because it was simple and genuine, and came from a man who had known him for 14 minutes and had asked it without any agenda. Yeah, he said. I'm going to be okay. Good. Maurice pulled up to a building on 6th Avenue with the decisive halt of a man who has arrived at exactly the right place. Because you got that look. What look? Like someone who's already 10 moves ahead, but is making sure he looks like he's only thinking about the next one. Caleb looked at him. Maurice grinned. 19 years, my friend. You learn to read people. Caleb got out of the cab, reached through the window, and handed Maurice a tip that made the man look at the bills twice and then look up. That's too much, Maurice said. No half-second calls surcharge, Caleb said. Use it for your son. Maurice stared at him for another second. Then he nodded once, with the specific dignity of a man accepting something given in the right spirit. Caleb picked up his bag and walked into the building. The offices of Meridian Capital occupied the 31st through 34th floors of a building on 6th Avenue that had been designed to communicate the specific message that the people inside it had arrived, and intended to stay arrived. The lobby was a study in deliberate understatement, expensive materials deployed modestly. The way serious money tends to present itself once it has stopped needing to perform. Caleb had been in rooms like this many times. He had built enough of his company to understand that these rooms were the vocabulary of a particular kind of power, not the only kind, and arguably not the most interesting kind, but real, nonetheless, and worth taking seriously. He checked in at the security desk. They had him in the system. He rode the elevator to the 32nd floor. The assistant who met him, young, efficient, with the specific wardrobe of someone who had studied very carefully what people in their position were supposed to wear, led him to a conference room and offered him water and coffee with the attentive neutrality of someone whose job required them to treat everyone identically, regardless of internal assessment. He took the coffee. He sat at the table. He was 12 minutes early, which was deliberate. He always arrived to important meetings early enough to be in the room before the other parties, not as a power play, but because he liked the room when it was empty. He liked to understand the space before it filled with other people's energy. He set his laptop on the table and looked at his notes from the flight. 40 minutes of raw thinking, still ungainly in the way that first drafts are always ungainly, but with something in it that felt real. He read through it twice, tightening it in his head, finding the shape beneath the raw material. His phone buzzed. Dina. He picked up. Before you say anything, she said, in the tone she used when she had been managing a situation for more than an hour, and had reached the phase where she was going to deliver information without inflection, and he would simply need to absorb it. The story is already moving. What story? The airport story, the runway. Someone on your flight posted something. I don't know exactly what yet, but it's been picked up. 3 news accounts in the last 40 minutes. It's going to be bigger before it gets smaller. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. How big? I've had calls from 2 network journalists, 1 podcast, and someone's assistant who wouldn't give me a name but I'm pretty sure works for a morning show. He set down his coffee. What did you tell them? That you're unavailable, that the company will release a statement in due course, and that in the meantime, they should probably look up Brooks Aviation Group's community investment record, because whatever narrative they're building, the fuller picture is more interesting. That's exactly right. I know it's exactly right, Caleb. That's why I said it. A pause. Are you okay? People keep asking me that today. It's because we know you. Her voice shifted slightly. Dina had been his assistant for 6 years, which meant she had also known Elena, which meant she occupied a particular place in the architecture of his life. You take things on. You process them alone. You build something out of them before you've let yourself actually feel them. I felt them, he said quietly. In row 42. A pause. Good. Her professionalism returned, clean and efficient. The meeting. You're ready? I'm early. Good. James Whitfield is going to lead for Meridian. He's thorough. He'll want specifics on the Phase 3 rollout, and I'd expect him to push on the liability framework around the automated boarding systems. I've got the liability numbers. And Marcus Chen will be there. He's their tech due diligence guy, and he's genuinely sharp, so don't let the youth fool you. I never let youth fool me. You said that about the intern last spring who turned out to be 26. That was different. It was not different. He could hear her smiling. Go have your meeting. Call me after. And Caleb the statement. When you're ready to write it, I want to be in that room. You'll be in that room. Good. A beat. Maya called me this morning. He sat up slightly. What? About 20 minutes after you left. She wanted to know if I had your flight number, because she was monitoring the situation. Her words. He put his hand over his eyes for a second. She's 9. She's 9 going on 40, which you already know. Another beat. She also wanted me to know that she drew you a picture, and that you had it with you, and that it was, quote, really good, so he should look at it whenever he needs to. The conference room was quiet, and the city was 32 floors below him, and his daughter had called his assistant at 7 in the morning to report on the status of a drawing she had given him, and to ensure that he would consult it in moments of difficulty. And Caleb sat with that for a second, and felt something move through him that was simultaneously grief and gratitude, and a love so large it occasionally alarmed him with its size. She did good work on it, he said. The plane looks more like a bus, but the spirit is right. Dina laughed. Go to your meeting going. He hung up. He straightened his sweater. He was still wearing the gray sweater. He had considered, in a theoretical way, that this was perhaps not optimal meeting attire for a conference room at Meridian Capital. He had considered it and then set the consideration aside, because he had learned something in 36 years of being Caleb Brooks that he was not going to unlearn in a conference room, that the moment he started dressing for other people's assumptions was the moment what those assumptions won. He would walk into the meeting in the same sweater he had worn to row 42, and the meeting would be fine. Because the meeting was about what he'd built, and what he'd built was real, and real things didn't require expensive fabric to make their case. James Whitfield was 61, with the particular energy of a man who had been in finance long enough to have seen every kind of person walk through his conference room door, and had formed, from that experience, a set of assessments that he trusted almost completely. He extended his hand to Caleb with the efficient warmth of someone who has calculated the appropriate warmth for a first meeting and landed on it precisely. Mr. Brooks, Jim Whitfield, welcome, Caleb. Good to meet you. We've been looking forward to this. Long time coming. He gestured toward the table, where 2 other men were already seated. Marcus Chen, who was indeed young, mid-30s maybe, with the specific alertness of someone who has prepared thoroughly and is slightly impatient to demonstrate it, and a third man, introduced as David Park, Meridian's general counsel, with the measured energy of someone whose job was to find the problems that everyone else was too excited to see. They sat. Someone poured water. The assistant from the lobby brought a tray of something and disappeared. And then James Whitfield, who had been in this room with hundreds of people and had a calibrated read on most of them within 4 minutes, said something that Caleb hadn't been expecting. Before we start, I saw the reports from Atlanta this morning. The airport delay. The room shifted slightly, not dramatically, but the attention in it changed quality. I travel through Atlanta regularly, Whitfield continued, and I heard the news segment, some kind of private aircraft on the runway. He looked at Caleb with the steady regard of a man who asks things directly, because he has decided that indirectness is a waste of time. That was connected to you, wasn't it? It wasn't quite a question. It was related to an incident on my departure flight. Yes, Caleb said. What kind of incident? Marcus Chen had gone very still in the particular way of someone who has excellent information processing instincts and has just identified something significant arriving. Caleb looked at Whitfield, then at Chen, then at David Park, who was looking at his notepad with the expression of a man who had already decided to pay very close attention to the next 60 seconds. I was moved from my first-class seat to economy class by crew members who didn't check my boarding pass, Caleb said. They made a judgment based on how I looked. The room absorbed this. Whitfield's face did something careful and controlled. I see. The ground hold on the runway was a result of a pre-authorized operational protocol on my company's side. Nobody made an emergency call. Nobody was trying to create an incident. The system ran a check, found an anomaly, and followed procedure. And you were the anomaly, Marcus Chen said. He said it with a precision that suggested he'd already understood the architecture of the situation. I was not where I was supposed to be. David Park looked up from his notepad. Is there going to be legal action? No, a beat. No, Park said. He had clearly not prepared for this answer. I had a conversation this morning with the crew members involved. I've requested a structural review of crew protocols from the airline's VP of Operations. I'm building a training program on the back of this. That's the response. There's no lawsuit. Whitfield was watching him with an expression that Kolb couldn't quite categorize. It was too carefully composed to read in one piece. Why not? Because a lawsuit would make the story about me. And the story isn't about me. What's the story about? Caleb looked at him. It's about what happens in the half-second before a person decides who they're looking at. That happens in airports and cab rides and conference rooms and everywhere else. A lawsuit changes the behavior in airports. The training program tries to change the half-second. He paused. One of those is more useful than the other. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You built Brooks Aviation Group in 8 years. 9. But the first year was mostly mistakes. Revenue of," he glanced at something in front of him, $340 million last year. 62 employees, ground operations contracts in 6 major hubs. 37 full-time, the rest contract, and yes, 6 hubs. You started it alone, after your wife died. Caleb looked at him steadily. You did your homework. We always do our homework. Whitfield folded his hands on the table. But I want to understand something, and it not be a strictly financial question, so bear with me. Go ahead. You had a significant incident this morning. You're in a new city. You've been processing something that most people would not handle the way you appear to have handled it. And you are sitting here in this conference room, in the same sweater you wore on the plane, 8 minutes ahead of schedule, ready to talk about Phase 3 rollout timelines. He paused. What does that tell me about you as a business partner? The question landed in the room and sat there. Marcus Chen had his pen up, which meant he was ready to write down the answer. Caleb thought about it. Not because he didn't know the answer, because the answer deserved a moment before he gave it. It tells you that I compartmentalize well, he said finally, which is useful but also worth watching. It tells you that I built this company on a schedule that didn't accommodate falling apart, and that pattern is still operating. He paused. But I think the more useful data point is what I chose to do with what happened this morning. I had leverage, real leverage. I could have burned something down and been entirely justified. I chose to build something instead. That's what I do. Every time I have a choice between burning and building, I build. That's been true for 9 years, through a lot of moments that tested it. If you want to know what kind of business partner I am, that's probably the most honest thing I can offer you. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Whitfield said, "Fair enough," and he opened the folder in front of him. Let's talk about Phase 3. The meeting ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. James Whitfield was thorough in the way that Dina had predicted. He wanted the Phase 3 rollout in specific numbers, sequenced timelines, risk-weighted scenarios. He asked questions that were designed to find the seams in the presentation, the places where confidence outran evidence, the optimistic assumptions dressed up as projections. Caleb had the numbers. He had run the scenarios. He had stress-tested the assumptions against 3 different market conditions and brought the documentation that showed the work. Marcus Chen was sharper than his composure suggested. He went after the automated boarding system liability framework with the specific precision of someone who had spent time with the technical documentation and had found 3 places where the language was softer than the engineering justified. He was right about 2 of them. Caleb told him so, and then told him what he was going to do to tighten the language, and Chen wrote it down with the slight satisfaction of someone who has done their job. David Park said less than either of them, but the questions he asked were the kind that carry more weight than their length suggested. He asked about the operational protocol that had triggered the ground hold in Atlanta. He asked it, neutrally, as a due diligence question, and Caleb answered it the same way the protocol existed. It was a standard check. It had functioned as designed. Park wrote something down and did not follow up, which meant either he was satisfied or he had decided to follow up through other channels, and either way Caleb was comfortable. At 2 hours and 30 minutes, Whitfield set down his pen and looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who has completed a calculation. We've done a lot of meetings in this room, he said. A lot of founder pitches, a lot of growth stage companies asking for Series B money. He paused. We don't usually make decisions in the room. I know. But I want to tell you something before you leave, and I want you to take it however you want to take it. He looked at Caleb over the folded hands. We've been looking at Brooks Aviation Group for 4 months. The financials are strong. The technology is differentiated. The contracts are real. Marcus has concerns about 2 line items in the liability language, and those will need to be addressed before anything is signed. He glanced at Chen, who nodded. But what decided this for me? He stopped. Let me ask you one thing first. Ask, when you were sitting in row 42 this morning, after they moved you, before the ground hold, what were you thinking about? Caleb looked at him. The question surprised him. Not because it was inappropriate. Whitfield had established his right to direct questions in the first 5 minutes, but because it was specific and personal and cut past everything that was professional and landed somewhere else entirely. My daughter, he said. Whitfield nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he had expected, but needed to hear confirmed. What about her? She'd given me a drawing before I left. The 2 of us in front of a plane. She'd written Daddy Comes Home at the bottom. He looked at the table. I was holding it. I was sitting in the last row of economy class, holding my daughter's drawing, and I was thinking about what I was thinking was going to tell her when I got home. How I was going to explain what happened in a way that was true and honest, but didn't put something in her that would be hard to carry. The room was very quiet. And what did you decide to tell her? That some people made wrong assumptions and then had to figure out what to do with them. And that I handled it. He paused, and then I told her I'd bring her croissants. Whitfield smiled. It was a real smile, not a managed one, the first completely unmanaged expression he had produced in nearly 3 hours, and it changed his face considerably. Meridian is going to invest in Brooks Aviation Group, he said. The specific terms will go through legal, and it will take a few weeks, and Marcus is going to send you a list of the documentation he needs for due diligence, close, and you will find the 2 liability items and fix the language before the term sheet is finalized. He'd unfolded his hands. But yes, we're in. Caleb looked at him. He felt something, not the performance of feeling something, not the managed expression of a founder receiving good news in a meeting. Something real. Something that had weight. Thank you, he said. And then why? Whitfield tilted his head. What decided it? You said what decided this for me, and then asked about row 42. What's the connection? Whitfield considered how to answer this. He took his time with it, the way he had taken his time with everything in the meeting, deliberately, without apology for the length of his thinking. I've been in rooms with a lot of people, he said finally. Brilliant people. Driven people. People with better numbers than yours on paper. And I've learned after a long time that what I'm really evaluating is what someone does when they have power and the other person doesn't know it. Because that's the truest version of who they are. He looked at Caleb. This morning, you had significant power, and the crew members didn't know it. You walked to row 42. You held your daughter's drawing. You built a training program in your head instead of building a case. He paused. That's who you are when nobody's watching. Or when everybody's watching and doesn't know what they're seeing. He nodded once. That's who I want to do business with. Caleb sat with that for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and took out the drawing. He unfolded it and laid it flat on the conference table. The flying bus, the enormous smiles, Daddy Comes Home. He let Whitfield look at it. Marcus Chen looked at it from across the table with an expression that was trying to stay professional and not entirely succeeding. David Park, who had said very little, for 2 hours and 40 minutes, said quietly, "That's really good." "She thinks so too," Caleb said. He folded it back along its crease and returned it to his pocket. He stood. Whitfield stood. They shook hands. Chen and Park stood and shook hands. The efficient assistant appeared at the conference room door with the timing of someone who had been listening for the shift in energy that signaled an ending. "Marcus will send you the due diligence list by end of week," Whitfield said as they moved toward the door. "I'll have Dina coordinate." "Good." Whitfield walked with him toward the elevator. "The training program you mentioned. For the airline." "Yes. When it's developed, when you have something real, I'd like to see it." Meridian has some interests in the hospitality and transportation space where something like that could have application beyond aviation. Caleb looked at him. You're already thinking about scaling it. That's what we do. A slight smile. You built something this morning, out of something that happened to you. That's a particular kind of intelligence. I'd like to see where it goes. The elevator arrived. Caleb stepped in. Tell your daughter, the drawing is excellent, Whitfield said. I'll tell her it got a positive reception in a New York boardroom, Caleb said. That'll make her day. The doors closed. He rode down 32 floors in a 6th Avenue elevator in a gray sweater with a 9-year-old's drawing in his pocket and a commitment from Meridian Capital in his recent history and the beginning of a training program in his laptop. And he thought about the morning as a complete thing. All of it. The 3:47 conversation in the dark. The flight attendant's moving eyes. Gerald's operational authority. Row 42. The drawing. Maurice the cab driver and his no half-second calls rule. The conference room and Whitfield's question about what he was thinking when he was sitting in the back of the plane. He thought about the through line that connected all of it. He had been treated as though he had no power. He had chosen, at every point, to use the power he had in a way that built, rather than burned. And every person he had encountered who had looked past the gray sweater and the old backpack and actually engaged with who he was. Maurice, Whitfield, even Patricia Holloway, with her wet eyes had encountered something that changed them in a small, real way. That was the through line, not the jet on the runway, not the boardroom, not the contract. The through line was the decision, made again and again throughout the morning, to show up as himself completely, without apology, without performance, without the protective armor that the world kept offering him, and that he kept refusing. The lobby arrived. He walked through it. He pushed through the revolving door onto 6th Avenue, and the city came at him with its full force, the sound, the movement, the particular pressure of New York in midday, the feeling of being inside something too large to perceive all at once. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He took out his phone. He called Denna. How'd it go? Meridian is in. A pause. Then, in a voice that contained several things at once, Caleb. Yeah, Caleb, that's extraordinary, I know. The Phase 3 rollout. I'll tell you everything tonight. Right now, I need you to do something for me. Of course. Find me the best bakery in Midtown Manhattan that sells croissants. I need 3. And I need to know how to get them on a flight home without them turning into structural failures. Dina was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she laughed, the real laugh, the one she reserved for moments when Caleb was being exactly himself in the way that occasionally caught her off guard, even after 6 years. I'll find your croissants, she said. Thank you. He put the phone away. He looked at the city. It was large and loud and indifferent, in the way that New York is specifically, unapologetically indifferent. And he stood in the middle of it in his gray sweater and felt, for the first time since 3:47 in the morning, something that was simply, cleanly, completely all right. Not triumphant, not vindicated, not satisfied in the hollow way of someone who has proven a point. Just all right. The morning had happened. He had moved through it. He had built something out of it instead of burning anything down. He had handled it. He started walking. 3 croissants. A flight home. A 9-year-old who had called his assistant at 7 in the morning to monitor the situation and ensure that the drawing was being consulted in moments of difficulty. He had a lot of work still to do. He was looking forward to all of it. The croissants were from a place on West 47th Street that Dina had identified with the specific efficiency of someone who had spent 6 years solving problems that other people hadn't thought to think about yet. The bakery was small, French-owned, and operated with the particular pride of an establishment that had decided its product required no explanation or apology. Caleb walked in, ordered 3, watched the woman behind the counter box them, with the care of someone packaging something that mattered, and paid without looking at the price. Because some things were simply not about the price. He was standing on the sidewalk outside the bakery, box under his arm, when his phone rang. Not Dina, not Maya, not anyone from the meeting. The number had an Atlanta area code, and he didn't recognize it, which was unusual. Because Caleb, Brooks did not give his personal number to people he didn't know, which meant whoever was calling had gotten it from someone he did know. which meant this was either important or a significant breach of his contact management system. And he was going to need to know which. He answered. Mr. Brooks. The voice was male, older, with the measured cadence of someone who had spent choosing words carefully in situations where the wrong word had consequences. My name is Robert Ashford. I'm the CEO of Continental Sky Airlines. Caleb stood on West 47th Street with his croissant box and said nothing for a moment. Robert Ashford. He knew the name. He had been in the same industry conference rooms as the name, though never in a direct meeting. Continental Sky was one of the 6 carriers his ground operations contracts touched. Their VP of Ground Operations was Sandra Wees, who had met him in the jet bridge that morning, with the expression of someone who had been awakened by a very bad phone call. Someone had made another phone call. Mr. Ashford, Caleb said. I want to apologize. Sandra Wees already apologized this morning. Sandra apologized on behalf of the incident. I'm calling to apologize on behalf of the company. A pause. There's a difference. Caleb thought about that. There is, he conceded. I've spent the last 3 hours review what happened on flight 1147 this morning. I've spoken with Sandra. I've reviewed the crew reports and the passenger manifest and the timeline of the ground hold. And I want to be direct with you, because I think you deserve directness, and I think you've had enough managed language for one day. I'd appreciate that. What happened this morning was a failure of training, yes. It was a failure of protocol, yes, but it was also a failure of culture. And culture is my responsibility, not Sandra's, not Gerald Marsh's, not Patricia Holloway's, mine. Another pause, the kind of pause that has weight in it. I've been in this industry for 31 years. I know what happened in that cabin. I know what it was. And I'm not going to dress it up in HR language and call it a seating discrepancy. Caleb was quiet for a moment. People moved past him on the sidewalk, a man in a suit, 2 women in conversation, a delivery cyclist navigating the curb, and the city did what the city always did, which was continue regardless. What are you asking me for, Mr. Ashford? Robert. And I'm not asking you for anything. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to meet with me. When? I can be in Atlanta by Thursday, or I can have a car at your office tomorrow morning if New York works better. I'm flying home tonight, Thursday then, if that works. Caleb thought about his week. He thought about the Meridian follow-up and the due diligence list that Marcus Chen was going to send, and the training program that was still in raw note form on his laptop, and the structural review he'd requested from Sandra 37. People at Brooks Aviation Group who would need his time this week in various capacities. He thought about something else too. Robert Ashford had called him directly, not through legal, not through communications, not through a carefully worded letter, on company letterhead, that had been reviewed by 7 people before it went out. He had gotten Caleb's personal number from somewhere. Caleb was going to find out where, and called on a Wednesday afternoon, and said the word culture, and taken personal responsibility without being asked to. That was not nothing. Thursday works, Caleb said. My office. 10 in the morning. I'll be there. And Robert, I want you to know before Thursday that I'm not approaching this looking for anything punitive. I told Sandra the same thing. What I'm building is a training framework. I'd like to talk about whether Continental Sky wants to be part of the development process rather than just the recipient of it. A pause. You want us involved in building the thing that addresses what we did. I want the people closest to the problem to be part of the solution. Yes, another pause, longer this time. Most people in your position would be talking to their lawyers right now. I know. Why aren't you? Caleb looked down the block at the city doing its relentless thing. Because my daughter asked me not to let anybody make me small, he said. And the way I stay unsmall isn't by making other people smaller. It's by building things that are bigger than what happened. Robert Ashford was quiet for a long moment. Thursday at 10, he said finally. I'll be there. See you then. He hung up. He stood on West 47th Street with his croissant box and his old backpack and his gray sweater, and he thought that this was the thing about power that most people in his world didn't fully understand, that the most powerful move was almost never the obvious one. The obvious move this morning had been to stay in seat 3A and refuse to move and demand a manager and make a scene. The second obvious move had been to go public immediately and let the story run. The third obvious move had been to call a lawyer from the jet bridge. He had made none of those moves. He had walked to row 42. He had held his daughter's drawing. He had built something in his head while the ground hold was running. He had talked to Gerald and Patricia like they were people capable of learning. He had gone to his meeting in his gray sweater and closed a deal that was going to change the shape of his company for the next decade. And now the CEO of the airline was calling him personally to apologize and ask for a meeting. The obvious moves would have gotten him none of this. He started walking back toward his hotel. The statement went out at 4:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Dina had written the first draft on her lunch break, sent it to Caleb at 2, gotten his revisions by 2:30, and gone through 2 more rounds before they both agreed it said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing that didn't. It was 4 paragraphs, no legal language, no performance of injury, no demands. The first paragraph described what had happened on Flight 1147 in plain, direct terms. The second paragraph stated clearly that Caleb was not pursuing legal action and had no interest in the public destruction of the crew members involved. The third paragraph described the training framework he was developing and invited other aviation industry partners to participate in the development process. The fourth paragraph was the one that Dina had flagged as potentially too personal and that Caleb had insisted on keeping exactly as written. "My daughter is 9 years old. She drew me a picture before I left home yesterday morning, the 2 of us, standing in front of an airplane. She wrote 'Daddy comes home' at the bottom. I kept it in my shirt pocket through everything that happened today. I want her to grow up in a world where the man in the gray sweater gets the same dignity as the man in the expensive suit, not because of what he owns or what he's built, but because dignity is not something that should require proof of income to access. That's what this is about. That's all it's about." Dina had looked at that paragraph for a long time before saying, "If you're sure." "I'm sure. It's going to move people. That's the point." It moved people. By 7 p.m., the statement had been shared 40,000 times. By 9, it was over 100,000. The phrase "Daddy comes home" was appearing in comments and reposts in a volume. That Dina, who had been in communications long enough to recognize the specific temperature of something going genuinely viral, described on the phone as extraordinary and a little frightening. Caleb was at his hotel when she called with the numbers. He had showered, changed into a clean version of the same gray sweater. He traveled with 3 and was sitting on the edge of the bed with his laptop open and his raw training notes on the screen, working through the structures of the framework the way he worked through everything, methodically, from the ground up, building the architecture, before he thought about the surface. "The morning show people called again," Dina said. "What did you tell them?" "That you'd consider it, which buys us time." "I don't want to do morning television, Dina. I know you don't, but I want you to think about something." Her voice shifted into the register she used when she had an argument prepared and had been waiting for the right moment to deploy it. "This morning, 12 people sat in a first-class cabin and said nothing. You talked about it with Sandra Weiss. You thought about it in row 42. That's the part that bothers you most, not Gerald, not the flight attendant, but the 12 people who watched and decided it wasn't their problem." Yes. Morning television reaches 4 million people who are having breakfast and deciding what they think about the world. That's 4 million people who watched what happened to you, in that cabin, in real time, and you get to tell them what to do with it. You get to give them the alternative to saying nothing. He was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since about noon." He looked at his training notes on the screen. The raw, ungainly first draft of something that was trying to become real. He thought about Maurice in the cab, with his no half-second calls rule. He thought about the 12 passengers. He thought about all the other 12 passengers, in all the other cabins, in all the other moments that never made it to a news cycle. Because the man being walked to row 42 to didn't happen to partially own the airline. But one interview, he said, not the morning shows. Find me someone who'll let me talk about the training framework without making it a grievance story. I want it to be about what comes next, not what happened. I know exactly who to call. Of course you do. Get some sleep. Your flight's at 8, Dina. Yes? The croissants made it through okay. I kept the box level the whole cab ride. A pause. Caleb. Yeah. You closed a round with Meridian and developed a training framework and had a call with an airline CEO and managed a national media story. All in one day. And you're telling me about the structural integrity of the pastries. They're important. They're very important. Good night. She hung up. He sat with his laptop for another hour, working through the framework. He had started calling it the 2-second standard in his notes. A name he wasn't sure about, but that captured the core of it. The mandatory pause between perception and action. The deliberate interruption of the half-second assumption. He had built out 3 modules by the time he closed the laptop and turned off the light. He lay in the hotel room in the dark and thought about the day as a sequence. The 3:47 conversation with Maya, the gate area, Gerald's face when Caleb stood at his full height and said fine, the elderly woman offering to switch seats, N8816M sitting on the runway in the early morning light, Sandra Weese's expression when she'd finally located him in row 42, Patricia Holloway's wet eyes, Maurice and his 19 years of watching the city, Whitfield's unmanaged smile, Robert Ashford's voice saying the word culture, like someone who had decided to own it. He thought about Elena. He thought about her the way he always thought about her in hotel rooms, specifically, with the particular sharpness of grief that quiet dark rooms tend to produce in people who have learned to manage grief in every other context. He thought about her chess games, about the way she had looked at him across the kitchen table at 3 in the morning and given him the sentence that had become the central organizing principle of his life, about her voice and her hands and the way she had laughed, and the specific sound Maya's laugh had when it hit the same register. He thought about the fact that Elena had never met the company, had never seen what it became, had never sat in a conference room at Meridian Capital and heard someone say, "We're in." He carried her through all of it without her, which was a particular kind of ache that had no clean description and that he had stopped trying to describe to people, because the descriptions always fell short in the same places. He would bring Maya to the office this weekend. He would show her the latest technical documentation on the Phase 3 rollout, in terms she could almost understand and be proud to almost understand. He would let her sit at his desk and spin in his chair and draw on his whiteboard while he worked through the training framework. He would order pizza at dinner time and let her pick the toppings, and they would eat it on the office floor, with the whole city visible through the floor-to-ceilings windows. He would tell her about the day. He would tell her all of it, in the careful, honest, appropriately scaled way that he told her difficult things because she deserved the truth and had always been able to hold more of it than people expected. He closed his eyes. He slept. The Atlanta morning was warm and clear, and the kind of cooperative that made you briefly forget the city could do anything else. Caleb's flight landed at 7:40. He was in his car by 8:15, and he was at the office by 8:50, which gave him 10 minutes before the day formally began. He used the 10 minutes to stand at his office window and look at the city with his coffee. He did this most mornings when he arrived. Early stood at the window, let the city resolve itself from abstract to specific, and thought about what the day needed. It was not meditation, which he had tried and found too structured. It was not prayer exactly, though it had some of that quality. It was simply a man standing at a window, giving himself permission to think before the thinking became reactive. Today, what the day needed was Terrence. Terrence Webb was Brooks Aviation Group's head of training and development, a 44-year-old former military logistics officer who had been with the company for 5 years and possessed the particular combination of systems thinking and human understanding that Caleb had found, in his experience, to be genuinely rare. Terrence understood how to build things that worked not just on paper, not just in the training room, but in the field, under pressure, in the half-second, between perception and decision. He was also the person in the building who would tell Caleb directly if an idea was bad. That was why Caleb needed him first. He called down to the training office at 9:02. Terrence, my office. Already on my way. I heard about Atlanta. What did you hear? Enough. I've been waiting for you to come to me since yesterday afternoon. How long does it take to put together a working framework for 2-second bias training? A pause. 2-second bias training. That's what I'm calling it. The mandatory pause between seeing a person and deciding you know their story. Another pause. This one had a different quality, the quality of someone who is rapidly processing whether an idea is good and arriving at a conclusion faster than they expected. That's actually, how long do we have before you want something presentable? Robert Ashford is sitting in my conference room at 10 o'clock Thursday morning. Thursday, yes, Thursday as in the Thursday that is 4 days from today. That would be the one. He heard Terrence moving, the sound of a man already walking while talking, already in action, before the call had formally committed to an action. I need Marcus and Yolanda from my team. I need you to send me the raw notes from the plane and last night. And I need you to stay out of my office until Wednesday afternoon. Done. And Caleb, yeah, this is a good idea. I've been thinking about something in space for 2 years and never had the right frame for it. 2-second standard is the right frame. Good. Build me something real. I always build you something real. He hung up. At 9:15, his assistant, Kevin, 26, organized to a degree that occasionally bordered on alarming. The kind of efficient that had been refined by 2 years of working for a man who thought faster than he talked, came in with a briefing sheet for the day, and the information that a journalist named Claire Okafor, from a national business and culture publication, had called 3 times, and that Dina had pre-approved her as the interview candidate. What do you know about her? Caleb asked. I read 12 of her pieces last night, Kevin said. He said this without consciousness, and without the self-consciousness that another 26-year-old brought to admitting they had spent their evening reading journalism to prepare for their boss's morning briefing. She doesn't write grievance stories. She writes about systems, institutional behavior, the gap between company policy and company culture, what changes organizations and what doesn't. She interviewed the CEO of a hospital system last year about implicit bias in emergency triage. It's the closest thing I found to what you're trying to do. Caleb looked at him, set it up, already drafting the email. Kevin, yes? Good work. Kevin nodded with the brief, professional satisfaction of someone who had done their job at the level they expected of themselves, and was glad to have it acknowledged without ceremony. Then he left. The day moved with the particular momentum that sometimes follows a significant event. Everything slightly accelerated, slightly more consequential than usual. The texture of ordinary work changed by what had happened the day before. Caleb moved through his schedule with the focused energy of a man who had slept well and woken with clarity, which were the 2 conditions under which he did his best thinking and his most useful work. At 11, he had a call with the legal team about the Meridian term sheet timeline. Marcus Chen had sent the due diligence list at 7:30 in the morning. The man had clearly also been up early, which Caleb respected, and it was thorough and specific and contained, as promised, the 2 liability items that needed addressing. He walked through it with legal and gave them what they needed, and hung up at 11:40, feeling that the Meridian piece was moving at the right speed. At 1, he had lunch with his CFO, Diana Reyes, who had been with the company for 4 years and had a particular way of looking at numbers that made them tell stories they didn't always tell themselves. Diana had read the statement. She had thoughts. There's the training framework, she said, over lunch in his office with the city visible through the window behind him. If you develop it internally and then license it. That's not the play, Caleb said. She looked at him. Diana Reyes had the specific look of someone who has spent 4 years with a man who operates from principles that don't always follow the most obvious financial logic, and has learned to trust the logic anyway, but still wants to understand it. Walk me through it. If I license a proprietary training product to airlines, I'm a vendor. They implement it, check a box, and move on. It becomes a compliance exercise. He set down his fork. If I develop it as an open-source industry framework, shared, collaborative, with Continental Sky and whoever else wants in as co-developers, then it's not a product. It's a standard. And standards change culture in ways that products can't. Diana was quiet for a moment. You give up the revenue. I give up the direct revenue. But I'm building infrastructure in the industry that has my name and my methodology embedded in it. Every airline that adopts it becomes a reference point. Every crew that goes through it knows where it came from. He paused. And frankly, Diana, I didn't build this company to sell training modules. I built it because I wanted to change how it worked at a systems level. This is a systems level opportunity. The revenue is a byproduct of the right strategy, not the strategy itself. She considered this for a long moment. Then, with the slight nod of someone who has run the numbers in a different direction and arrived at the same place, the goodwill value alone. I'm not calculating goodwill, I'm calculating impact. He looked at her. Run me the numbers on what it costs to develop this internally, with Terrence's team, over the next 60 days, versus what the exposure is worth at industry conferences, in media, in the conversations that happen in boardrooms when people are deciding who to call for aviation tech partnerships. That's the return on investment. Diana wrote something down. I'll have it by Friday, thank you. She looked up. Caleb. The statement yesterday, the fourth paragraph. Yes, that paragraph is going to be in the conversation about this company for a long time. I know. Is that what you wanted? He thought about it honestly. I wanted to tell the truth. The consequence is a side effect. She looked at him for a moment. Your wife, she stopped. Dina was the only person at the company who had known Elena directly, but Diana had been there long enough to understand the shape of what was present in the room whenever Elena came up. She would have liked the fourth paragraph. She wrote better than I do, he said. But yes, I think she would have. At 3:15, Kevin appeared in the doorway with the look of someone delivering information that had not been on the day's schedule. There's a woman at the front desk. She doesn't have an appointment. Who is she? Her name is Pamela Griffin. She says she was on flight 1147 yesterday morning. First class cabin. Kevin paused. She says she's in seat 4A. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Seat 4A, one row behind seat 3A. One row behind the seat they had asked him to vacate. Send her up, he said. Pamela Griffin was 63 years old, with the posture of a woman who had been brought up to stand straight and had never stopped, and the expression of someone who had been working up to a difficult thing for 24 hours and had finally decided to do it. She was dressed with the understated precision of a woman who had spent a long professional life in rooms where appearance communicated competence, and her hands, when she sat down across from Caleb in the chair that Diana had vacated an hour earlier, were folded tightly in her lap. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment, she said. You came a long way. I know where your office is because I looked it up. And I drove here because I thought if I called first, I'd talk myself out of it. She looked at him directly. The directness cost her something, he could see it, in the set of her jaw. I was in seat 4A yesterday morning. I watched everything that happened. I know, Caleb said quietly. I didn't say anything. I know that too. She held his gaze. I want to tell you why. Not to excuse it. I don't think it's excusable. But I want you to understand it, because you talked about the 12 people, and I was one of them, and She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly, continued. I've been in situations where I was the person, where I was the one being treated that way, and nobody said anything. I know what that feels like. I have known what that feels like my entire adult life. She paused, and I still sat there. Caleb said nothing. He let the space hold what she was saying. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself the crew was handling it. I told myself that maybe there was a misunderstanding, and it would resolve itself, and it would be worse to get involved. She shook her head. I was telling myself stories. The real answer is, I was afraid of the discomfort of speaking up, and I chose my comfort over your dignity. And I read your statement last night, and I couldn't sleep. The office was quiet. Outside the window, the city moved through its afternoon. How long did it take you to decide to come here? Caleb asked. About 14 hours. I wrote the drive from the airport. I knew where you were because your company's address is on the website. A slight, self-deprecating pause. I almost turned around twice. But you didn't, no. Why not? She looked at him. Because your statement said that the 12 people were going to get on another plane and watch it happen again, and keep deciding it wasn't their problem. And I don't want to be that person. I have been that person, in various forms, for various reasons, my whole life, and I'm 63 years old and I would like to stop being that person before I run out of time. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what his wife would have said. He thought about what was true. The decision to come here, he said, is harder than the decision to speak up in the moment. The moment is fast, fear wins, because fear is faster than courage in real time. Coming here, a day later, when nobody required it, when you could have just carried the guilt quietly and let it fade, that's different. That takes something. She looked at him carefully. You're not angry at me, not at you specifically. At the situation. At the conditions that make it easier to stay quiet than to say something. At the 30 years of ambient permission that tells people that other people's dignity is somebody else's problem. He paused. You're not the villain of yesterday, Mrs. Griffithan. Gerald and Patricia have already said what needs to be said, about what they did. You're something else. What am I? You're the reason the training framework has to include a bystander component. He looked at her. Caleb Brooks. How do you do? She blinked. Then, in spite of everything, something shifted in her face, a small, real thing. The kind that happens when tension breaks through relief. Pamela Griffin, retired, 40 years in education administration. 40 years in education, middle and high school, mostly in systems that were underfunded and understaffed, and where the adults who were supposed to help were also quiet when they shouldn't have been. She paused. I spent 40 years telling children to speak up. I sat in seat 4A and said nothing. Would you be willing to tell that story? In a development context. Not publicly, I won't put you in front of cameras. But I have a team building a training program, and what you just described, the internal negotiation, the stories you told yourself, the moment you chose comfort over action, that's exactly the material we need. Because we can train people on policy all day long. What we can't train without real experience is the specific anatomy of the moment when a person decides to stay quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. You're asking me to help you build the thing that addresses what I failed to do. Yes, she stopped. Started again. That's either the most generous thing anyone has ever asked me, or the most instructive. I'm hoping both. Then, with the decision in it, yes. I'll help, he nodded. I'll have Kevin get your contact information on your way out. Terrence Webb, my head of training, will reach out by end of week. She stood. He stood. She extended her hand and he shook it. And something passed between them that was not resolution exactly. Resolution was too clean a word for it, but was something adjacent to it. Something that contained the specific gravity of two people acknowledging that the morning before had happened, and that they were both, in their different ways, trying to build something from it. At the door she turned back. Your daughter's drawing, she said. The one in the statement. Yes, I have a granddaughter. She's 7. She draws things too. She paused. I'm going to tell her this story when she's old enough to understand it. Which part? He asked. All of it, she said. Including the part where I sat in seat 4A and didn't speak. He looked at her. That part is important, I know, she said. That's why I'm going to tell it. She left. He stood at his window for a moment after she was gone, with the city outside, and the coffee that had gone cold on his desk, and the training framework open on his laptop, and the drawing in his shirt pocket, and the meeting with Robert Ashford on Thursday morning, and the croissants that he'd kept in the passenger seat on the drive from the airport, specifically to prevent structural failure. He thought about Maya, who would be home from school in 2 hours. He thought about Elena, who had said that character was proven when you had the power to embarrass someone and chose not to. He thought about Maurice and his 19 years in the front seat, and his son at Columbia and the no half-second calls rule. He thought about Patricia Holloway's wet eyes, and Robert Ashford saying the word culture, and James Whitfield's unmanaged smile, and Pamela Griffin coming through his door without an appointment, because she had decided, 14 hours later, that she did not want to be the person who watched. He thought about all the people who were going to have a conversation tonight, because of a statement with 4 paragraphs and a drawing of a flying bus, He thought about all the people who were not going to have any conversation at all, who were going to read it and feel something, and scroll past and continue their evening, and the fact that even that, the momentary feeling, the half-second interruption of the scrolling was not entirely nothing. He picked up his coffee. He sat down at his desk. He opened the training framework. He had a lot of work to do, and not much time to do it, and he was very good at exactly that combination of conditions. He had built a company in those conditions. He had raised a daughter in those conditions. He had held together, in those conditions, after the worst day of his life, and had built something from the holding together that was real and mattered and had 37 people working on it. And now a Series B from Meridian Capital, and a CEO calling his personal phone to apologize, and a 63-year-old retired educator sitting in his conference room, willing to tell the story of the moment she stayed quiet. He started typing. The city moved outside the window. The afternoon light shifted through the glass, and in his shirt pocket, pressed flat and folded along its original crease, a drawing of a flying bus with two enormous smiling figures, waited patiently for the moment when someone would unfold it again. Which was the thing about that drawing, it was always there, it was always waiting, and it always, without fail, said exactly what needed to be said. Daddy comes home. He was already home. He was building something. Thursday morning arrived the way important mornings often do, quietly, without announcement, carrying the weight of everything that had built toward it. Caleb was at the office by 8:30. He had driven Maya to school himself, which was not always possible on meeting days, but which he had arranged this morning specifically because he needed it. She had eaten her breakfast, packed her bag, climbed into the car with the unhurried confidence of a child who has a father who shows up, and spent the 12-minute drive telling him in precise detail about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend Zoe over the correct pronunciation of a word in a book they were both reading. He had listened to every word. At the school drop-off, she had leaned over, pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder the way she always did, and said, "Good luck with your meeting today." "How do you know I have a big meeting today?" "Kevin told me." "Kevin told you?" "I called the office yesterday. He said you had something important on Thursday and that you'd been working really hard on it." Caleb made a mental note to have a brief conversation with Kevin about the appropriate scope of information sharing with 9-year-olds. He also made a mental note that Maya had called his office to check on him, which was something he was going to need to think about carefully later, in the quiet, because it contained too much in it to process while also navigating school drop-off traffic. "I'll tell you how it goes tonight," he said. "I know you will." She grabbed her bag. "Daddy? Yeah. Do you have the drawing?" He touched his shirt pocket. "Right here," she nodded once with finality. "Good." She was out of a car and moving toward the school entrance with the purposeful stride of someone who had done what they came to do and was now moving on to the next thing, and Caleb watched her go until she disappeared through the doors. And then he sat in the car for a moment in the drop-off lane, while a minivan behind him waited patiently, and he felt something large and quiet move through him the way it always did when Maya walked away and he watched her go. He drove to the office. He had work to do. Robert Ashford arrived at 10 o'clock exactly, which told Caleb something. Men who arrived exactly on time to meetings they had requested were men who had spent the drive thinking carefully about what they were walking into and had decided to signal respect through precision. Ashford was 64, silver-haired, with the particular physical authority of someone who had run a large organization for long enough that it had become simply how he occupied space. He shook Caleb's hand with the directness of a man who had decided before he walked through the door that there would be no performance in this meeting. Terrence was already in the conference room. Caleb had asked him to be there because the training framework was the point, and Terrence had spent 4 days building something that was ready to be seen. They sat. Kevin brought coffee. Nobody performed small talk. "I want to start with an acknowledgement," Ashford said. "Not a corporate one, a personal one." He looked at Caleb across the table with the steady regard abode of a man who has decided that directness is the only currency worth spending. "I've been in aviation for 31 years. I've sat in the CEO's chair for 9. And I have known, for most of those 9 years, that what happened on Flight 1147 was happening. Not in those specific words, not with that specific passenger. But I knew the culture that made it possible, and I managed around it instead of through it. That's on me. The conference room was quiet. I'm not here to negotiate, Ashford continued. I'm here to ask what we can build together. You extended that invitation on the phone. I'm accepting it. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded to Terrence. Terrence Webb opened his laptop. What followed was 90 minutes of the most substantive conversation Caleb had been in all week, and the week had contained a Meridian Capital closing. Terrence walked through the 2-second standard framework with the systematic precision of a man who had spent 30 years in military logistics and understood that the distance between a good idea and a working system was filled entirely with specific, unglamorous details. The framework had 3 modules. The first addressed the anatomy of assumption, how bias operated in the half-second before conscious thought engaged, drawn from cognitive science research that Terrence had spent 2 days with. The second addressed verification protocols, the structural, procedural interventions that created mandatory pauses in crew workflow before passenger interaction decisions were made. The third, and the one Caleb had built himself from his conversation with Pamela Griffin, addressed bystander activation, the specific internal negotiation that happened when a person witnessed something and decided whether to speak. Ashford asked precise questions. He pushed back on the implementation timeline for Module 2, arguing that crew scheduling realities made the proposed rollout window optimistic. Terrence pushed back on the pushback with data from Continental Sky's own scheduling records, which he had obtained through Sandra Weiss. Ashford looked at the data and said, "Fair point," and then he asked 3 more questions and made 2 suggestions that were genuinely good, and that Terrence wrote down without being asked. At the 90-minute mark, Ashford leaned back in his chair. "I want Continental Sky to be a founding partner in the development of this framework," he said. "Not a recipient of the final product, a builder of it. I'll commit resources, my training team, crew consultation hours, implementation pilots at 2 hubs in the first phase." He paused. "I'd also like to approach 3 other major carriers about joining the development coalition. Collectively, we cover about 60% of domestic passenger volume. If this becomes a coalition standard, rather than one airline's program, it changes the industry baseline." Caleb looked at him. "You want to take this further than I proposed. You told me on the phone that you wanted to change the half-second. One airline's training program changes behavior at one airline. A coalition standard changes what's considered normal across the industry." He held Caleb's gaze. "You built something real this week, out of something that happened to you on a Wednesday morning. I'd like to help make sure it reaches further than one conversation in an Atlanta conference room." Terrence was very still in the specific way that people go still when they are trying not to show how significant a moment is. Caleb thought about Whitfield saying standards change culture in ways products can't. He thought about Diana saying, "Run me the numbers." He thought about Terrence saying, "I've been thinking about something in this space for 2 years and never had the right frame." He thought about Elena, who had loved chess and had understood, better than he ever had, how far ahead you needed to see. "Yes," he said, "let's build it that way." The months that followed were the kind that don't make good highlight reels, because the work in them is too granular and specific to condense hours in development sessions, iteration on module language, pilot programs at 2 Continental Sky hubs and 1 partner carrier, data collection, revision, more iteration. Terrence drove it with the methodical force of someone who understood that good frameworks were not written, they were built, and building took time that couldn't be hurried without consequences. Pamela Griffin consulted on the bystander module with the precise, unflinching honesty of a woman who had decided she was done staying quiet about things that mattered. She sat in development sessions and described, in careful specific detail, the internal negotiation of Seat 4A, the stories, the rationalizations, the moment of choice, and the crew members and trainers in the room listened to her. The way people listen when something is being said that is true in the way that only lived experience can be true. She was extraordinary at it. Caleb watched her in those sessions and thought about how the morning of Flight 1147 had moved outward in directions he couldn't have predicted, from Gerald and Petrovishton to Sandra Weiss, to Robert Ashford, to Pamela Griffin. All of them changed in their different ways by what had happened in a first-class cabin on a Wednesday morning in Atlanta. All of them carrying it forward into something that was larger than the original event. He thought about that often. About how the biggest things usually started small. About how the decision to walk to row 42, instead of fighting for seat 3A, had created the conditions for everything that followed. About how Elena's sentence about character and power and the choice not to embarrass had been the actual beginning of all of it, years before the morning it was tested. The interview with Claire Okafor ran in February. It was long and careful and said what needed to be said without making Caleb into a symbol or a grievance or a story with edges too clean to be real. Claire had asked him, near the end, what he wanted people to take from what had happened. He had thought about it for a moment. "I want the person in seat 4A to speak up next time," he said. "That's it. If one person who read that statement, or read this article, or heard about this somewhere sits in a cabin next time and decides that someone else's dignity is their problem too. That's the whole thing. That's what this was for." The article was read by a great many people. Caleb knew this because Dina kept track and reported it to him with the precision of someone who understood that the data mattered without being precious about it. He received letters, actual paper letters, from people who had been in situations like his, who had been walked from seats and turned away from counters and followed through stores and had carried those moments quietly for years with nowhere to put them. He read every one of them. He responded to most of them. In short, direct notes that said, "I hear you. What happened to you was wrong. I'm trying to build something that makes it less likely to happen to the next person. Thank you for telling me." He kept all the letters in a drawer in his office. He thought of them as part of the foundation. 6 months after Flight 1147, the 2-second standard launched as an industry coalition framework, co-developed by Continental Sky, 3 partner carriers, and Brooks Aviation Group's training division. Robert Ashford stood at the podium at the launch press conference and said things that were accurate and well-phrased and appropriately institutional. Terrence stood beside Caleb in the back of the room with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has built something real and is allowing himself, briefly and without excessive ceremony, to acknowledge that now. When the press conference ended and the room began its post-event dispersal, Caleb found a quiet corner and took out his phone. He called Maya. She answered immediately. Did it happen? It happened. Was it good? Did people clap? People clap. A pause. The particular pause of a 9-year-old who has been waiting for news and has received it, and is now processing whether it matches the scenario she had constructed in her head. Daddy? Yeah. Remember when you came home from New York with the croissants and told me the whole story? I remember. I've been thinking about something since then. Tell me. If they hadn't moved you to row 42, she paused, working through it with the careful deliberation that was entirely her own. Would you have built the thing? He was quiet for a moment. It was a real question. It deserved a real answer. I don't know, he said honestly. I'd been thinking about bias in service delivery for a long time. The technology side of our work touched and constantly. But the framework, the specific shape of it, the bystander module, the 2-second name, I don't think I had it before that morning. He paused. Sometimes the thing that breaks you open is also the thing that shows you what was inside. Maya was quiet, which meant she was that sentence up to the light, turning it the way she turned everything that mattered. Mom would have said something like that, she said finally. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Yeah, she would have. I wrote it down, Maya said, in my journal. Is that okay? That's more than okay. Okay. The sound of her school bag. She was at home now. It was after 3. The sitter would be there. Daddy, the drawing. Do you still have it? He reached into his shirt pocket. Right here, he said. She made a sound that was satisfied in a way that didn't require more words than that. Then I'm going to draw you a new one. What of? I don't know yet. Something that matches where we are now, instead of where we were then. A pause. The old one had the bus plane, because that's what I knew how to draw. I can do better now. The bus plane is my favorite drawing I own. I know, but you can have both. The sound of the front door and the sitter's voice and the ordinary movement of afternoon arriving home. I have to go. Come home for dinner? I'll be there by 6. I'm making pasta. You're 9. The sitter is making pasta. I'm supervising. He smiled. I'll be there by 6. Love you, Daddy. Love you, Maya. He hung up. He stood in the corner of the post-conference room, with his phone in his hand, and the drawing in his shirt pocket, and everything that the last 6 months had built around him, the framework, the coalition, the Meridian Partnership, the 37 people who had become 43, the letters in the drawer, Pamela Griffin's voice in the development sessions, Maurice's no half-second calls rule embedded in the bystander module, without Maurice's name on it, but with his truth in every line, and he felt the full weight of it, not as a burden, but as the specific gravity of something real. He thought about Elena. He thought about the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, and the sentence about character and power, and the choice not to embarrass. He thought about how she had given him that sentence, years before he needed it, and how he had carried it without fully understanding it until a Wednesday morning, when a flight attendant's eyes moved from his face, to his sweater, to his backpack, and arrived at a conclusion before she checked a single fact. He thought about row 42. He thought about N8816M, sitting on the runway in the early morning light, quiet and still and entirely purposeful. He thought about the 12 people who had watched and said nothing, and the one who had driven to his office 14 hours later and said, "I don't want to be that person anymore." He thought about all of it. Then he put his phone away, picked up his backpack, the same old Patagonia bag, 12 years old, 4 continents, still more life in it than he felt like admitting, and walked through the emptying room toward the exit, toward the parking garage, toward the drive home, toward the pasta that a 9-year-old was supervising, with the focused authority of someone who had decided she was ready for more responsibility, toward the conversation they would have at the kitchen table tonight, which would be honest and careful and scaled appropriately for a 9-year-old who was, increasingly, ready for the unscaled version, toward the new drawing she was going to make him, the one that matched where they were now instead of where they had been. He walked out into the afternoon. The city was doing what cities do, indifferent, relentless, too large to hold all at once, full of people making half-second decisions about each other, every moment of every day, most of those decisions, invisible and unmeasured and building, over time, into the culture that everyone lived inside of, without always being able to see its walls. He was trying to change 2 seconds of that, just 2 seconds, between seeing a person and deciding you knew their story. 2 seconds of mandatory pause. 2 seconds in which the assumption could not complete itself before a question interrupted it. 2 seconds that, deployed at scale, across 60% of domestic passenger volume, added up to something that was larger than a training program and larger than a press conference, and larger than any single story about a man in a gray sweater and an old backpack who had been walked from his seat on a Wednesday morning and had decided, somewhere in the last row of economy class, to build something from it instead of burning anything down. That was the whole thing. That had always been the whole thing. Caleb Brooks walked to his car, put his bag in the back, sat behind the wheel, and reached into his shirt pocket one more time. He unfolded the drawing along its original crease and looked at it for a moment. In the afternoon light, the flying bus, the enormous smiles, the words at the bottom in his daughter's careful, deliberate print. Then he folded it back, returned it to his pocket, started the car, and drove home. He had pasta to get to, and the greatest power he had ever owned was not the jet on the runway, not the contract with Meridian, not the coalition framework with his name embedded in its foundation. It was the knowledge proven on a Wednesday morning, in the last row of economy class, and every day in the 9 years before it, and every day in the 6 months since that dignity does not require permission. Character does not require an audience, and a man who knows exactly who he is cannot be made small by anyone who doesn't. Daddy comes home. He always did.